good afternoon. I want to thank also the organizers, the Globe Life, for inviting me to share this exciting seminar. So my background is in anthropology, as Margareta said, and that's the vision I'm going to give you today by providing a brief history of myths, facts, and interpretations of calamity, and depicting a bit what disaster studies is about. So before I do so, I want to share the screen. Let's see if I can get this going. Oops. You can see that, right?
Yeah.
Great. So how and why a disaster? And I'll start by taking you to the Global South, where I've done pretty much of my research. On April 29th, 2003, a disastrous flood occurred in the Argentinian city of Santa Fe. 23 people perished during the emergency. Another 100 people died due to indirect consequences of the disaster in the following months and years, as Margareta just mentioned. And around 130,000 inhabitants had to evacuate for weeks and months, some even for years. Hundreds of these families had no home at all to return to. The disaster management capacities of local authorities were largely surpassed on this occasion. Political decision makers at local and regional levels argued that they could never have foreseen the magnitude of this flood, and that the excessive rains in the week before the disaster was the work of nature. Hence, the disaster was also the work of nature. It was a natural disaster, as they argued. What they omitted to say was that the level of social vulnerability in the city was very high at the time of the flood, plus the fact that the levees placed to protect the population had not been completed. Hence, nature, as it were, could easily sneak into the city and flood it. This case illustrates one of the still persistent myths in public and political life of disasters when the worst happens. And that is the myth that disasters are the work of nature, that they are natural and they just happen like bolts from the blue, when research has shown that this is in fact not so, and that society is really the problem more than nature. So as an anthropologist, I'm interested in how disasters are framed in different societies. I analyze the narratives that explain a disaster, how it could happen, the causalities, effects, and responsibilities. And this is very important to understand. It's in fact crucial to understand this, because the meanings ascribed to calamity shape decision-making. It shaped the policies and the social action taken before, during, and after the events. Hence, it shapes the impact of a disaster. So it's safe to say that disasters are part of human history, and they've always occurred, causing loss and suffering. Hence, people have always struggled to try to understand disasters, why and how they have occurred. If we go back in history, there is research showing that around the time of the antique and in medieval times, the general notions was that disasters were fated and part of God's order. And a classical example of this is the deluge myth, I think, the flood myth. That is a great flood sent by God or the deities that destroy civilization in an act of divine retribution. And this narrative, this myth, is found in many mythologies around the world. And the painting here that you see in the slide by Gustave Doré illustrates the one told in the Christian Bible. But in the Enlightenment, something happened. When the earthquake and the tsunami that destroyed Lisbon occurred in 1755, this understanding of disasters as a divine retribution began to be questioned. And this was, as I said, in the time of the Enlightenment, and rational thinking was being promoted by intellectuals of the time. And this disaster, in fact, became a catalyst in strengthening this thinking. So on the right side, you see these philosophers, starting with Voltaire, and on the top, the French writer and philosopher who wrote a poem questioning how a supposedly benevolent God could allow such evil as a disaster to happen. And this is referred to as the theodicy problem in philosophy. The second man, Rousseau, on his part, he believed that the disaster was actually due to overcrowded and precarious urban living, which made him argue for a more naturalistic way of life far from the cities. And the third philosopher, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, at the end, he collected information about this earthquake, and he formulated a theory of the causes of it. While his theory was later proved not to be entirely correct, it was indeed, in any case, the first systematic attempt to explain earthquakes in natural rather than supernatural terms. And this was a game changer at the time. And this paradigm would forge the thinking around disasters for long. Not until the 20th century did society get into the equation, though, of understanding how and why disasters occurred. As the social sciences were expanding and growing stronger in this century, disasters also became the empirical object of study in geography, sociology, anthropology, political science, psychology, and more. And we can see two perspectives emerge from here: the structural and the behavioral approach. I'm sorry. And on this slide, you see the main differences between these two approaches. But what they do have in common is that they focus on society and they focus on human action and thinking that, it is argued, produce risk and disaster. And while they are two different approaches, I should say that today they are used very much in combination, and that they complement each other in focusing on different aspects of this. So these approaches in social sciences have produced a conceptual toolbox that is today used to understand the how and why of risk is produced and why disasters occur and what the effects are. And two of these concepts, vulnerability and resilience, are key here from the 1970s onwards. So vulnerability refers to, I quote, the characteristics of a person or group and their situation that influence their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impact of a natural hazard, according to a widely used definition. The resilience concept, on the other hand, refers instead to the individual and collective capacities to cope and recover. And the emergence of this latter concept in disaster studies in the 21st century was due to the critique of vulnerability theory that it was disempowering and patronizing to not acknowledge that people, despite their vulnerability, also had capacities to actively respond to risk and disaster. People were not then mere victims, as it were. And these theoretical concepts and scientific approaches have eventually also influenced policymaking around risk and disaster problems at international, regional, and national levels in many different ways, as Margareta can testify. So to finalize my very brief presentation, to debunk the myth that disasters are natural. Hazards can be natural, that is, they stem from nature, even if we today, perhaps in times of the Anthropocene, should probably question this axiom as well. So all disasters occur in a particular social context, and that produces vulnerability and resilience. The current pandemic is no exception. And I will certainly not go into each and one of these words in this cloud. At this moment, there's no time. Let me just notice that this morning in a Swedish newspaper, it was on their headlines, they raised the issue, they addressed that social inequality as crucial in dying from or with COVID-19 in Sweden as a key component. That was the news this morning. So inequality was indeed addressed. And they are, of course, right. We are not all in the same boat when disaster happens. So I'm convinced that to understand the causes and effects of the COVID-19 as any other disaster or crisis, and to learn from them from the future, we need to look closer at in this case, all these concepts and more to understand them. And there I am. Thank you so much.